What's the most impressive indie game you've ever seen? The Ascent, released last summer for PC and Xbox, is a strong candidate. This Unreal Engine 4 based isometric action game features dense environmental geometry, great lighting, and high quality particle effects. It's easily mistaken for a big budget title, but was in fact primarily made by a small Swedish studio with just 12 core developers. As visually striking as the Ascent was, it had two key issues: movement and frame rate stutter, which troubled all platforms to some degree, and extremely long load times, which affected Xbox One and One X. Enter the brand new PlayStation release. After 8 months of patching and content updates, the Ascent has landed on PS4, PS4 Pro, and PS5. Are these new releases the definitive console editions of the Ascent? The Ascent is a beautiful title that combines extremely detailed environmental geometry with stunning pyrotechnics. As action breaks out, the Ascent becomes an electrifying visual showcase, bathed in explosions, bullet trails, and correctly lit smoke. The interplay between the environment and the action is a key highlight here. Stray bullets and explosions chip at barriers and take chunks out of concrete slabs. Moreover, the game is quite visually cohesive and asset-rich for a game made by a smaller team. Despite massive levels packed with dense environmental meshes, everything seems to fit together surprisingly well, without any geometric or lighting discontinuities. Even the game's narrative sequences, which zoom into quite close range, don't highlight many shortcomings. The visuals serve as a good vehicle for the gameplay. On the surface, the Ascent might look like a twin-stick shooter, but it feels heavily influenced by action RPGs like Diablo. Enemies drop gear and currency, areas are huge and feature alternative pathways, and side quests abound. It's still a fast-paced game, but these RPG elements give it a bit more structure and drive an addictive gameplay loop. But all of that applies to the existing Xbox and PC versions as well as these new releases. So what are we specifically getting on the PlayStation platforms? PS5 unsurprisingly comes out on top, with an 1800p typical resolution. PS4 Pro falls back a little bit in terms of clarity, typically rendering at 1440p. PS4 takes a further hit and comes in at 900p. These resolutions were very consistent in my testing, although some dynamic res may be in effect. UE4's temporal anti-aliasing does a good job of cleaning up the image, so all consoles look stable and smooth in motion. There is a progression in image sharpness and clarity going from the PS4 to the Pro to the PS5, but they all hold up fairly well. Outside of image clarity, the PlayStation versions do look fairly similar, but in head-to-head comparisons there are a variety of settings differences across the machines. Ground detail is reduced on PS4, and distant environmental geometry is sometimes absent. Real-time shadow maps have less detail, and fewer objects appear to cast shadows. Bloom lighting takes on a different appearance, and generally looks a little bit weaker and less precise. The depth of field effect in cutscenes runs at a reduced quality, without a strong bokeh effect. Finally, the number of background NPCs in the environment is reduced. PS4 Pro occupies a bit of a middle ground between the two systems. Depth of field, bloom, and NPC density appear similar to PS5, while other settings look similar to PS4. The different versions of the Ascent look similar on the whole, but as you progress up the performance ladder, there are subtle but impactful upgrades. The detail enhancements on the stronger machines allow the game to scale more effectively to a 4K output. As expected, PS5 and Series X do stack up very similar visually, with identical looking settings and similar overall image clarity. There are some minor run-to-run differences in object and NPC placement, but there are no consistent visual changes between the two platforms. Performance issues beset the Xbox versions of the Ascent. There were two basic issues. Every so often when moving around the game world, the character and camera angle would jump forward, with a few frames of movement condensed into a single frame. It felt sort of like the game was suffering a brief performance hitch, but in reality the frame rate wasn't affected whatsoever. Your character would just slightly skip between frames. Performance would also dip in a more conventional sense. Framerate hitches lasting a few frames were common on Series X and Series S, and heavy combat would occasionally see performance slip into the 50s for short periods. Xbox One and One X had the same issues here, but were exacerbated by the weaker hardware, with more impactful and frequent hitches that often extended beyond 100 milliseconds. The good news is that the PS5 release is mostly in quite solid shape. Both performance issues return here, but don't impact on the experience too much. Actual framerate dips are relatively rare and are mostly isolated to quite heavy combat, with an occasional duplicate frame or two during traversal as well. The movement skips are still an annoyance on PS5, but I mostly got used to them over time, as they don't affect frame delivery and don't tend to surface during combat very much. In a head-to-head with Series X, trouble areas on Microsoft's console trade off with problematic areas on PS5. Entering the rooftop area seems to cause some issues on Series X that are much less pronounced on PS5. Conversely, walking into the waste recycling network area causes a huge explosion that causes PS5 to hitch for several frames in this run, while Series X is unimpeded. Both consoles generally hit 60 FPS, however. PS4 and PS4 Pro are cut back to a 30 FPS target. General gameplay actually sticks quite close to 30 FPS on both machines. The Ascent tends to drop frames in combat, as you might expect, but typically it's just a handful of duplicate frames per encounter. Some of the larger areas with lots of AI can push the systems harder, particularly the PS4, although this isn't too common. Unfortunately, the PS4 systems are plagued by stutter, dramatic frame time hitches that are much worse than on PS5 and Series X. Multi-frame pauses are common during traversal, which tend to last for 6 to 10 frames at 60 Hz. Asset streaming seems to be a particular difficulty for the last-gen console's weaker CPUs, which just can't seem to keep up as you travel the Ascent's large maps. This NPC-dense quest area highlights the problem at its worst, but it really is a constant annoyance throughout. The Ascent is serviceable enough on the PS4 consoles, but the experience on current-gen hardware is much improved. The title is just too demanding on the CPU to scale well to the aged, low-power Jaguar cores. In between these stutters, it mostly runs fine though, with a well-implemented 30 FPS cap without frame pacing issues. But it wasn't always this way. Throughout the pre-release period and for the first week or so after release, the Ascent was a very different game on PS4 and PS4 Pro. The framerate cap hadn't yet been implemented, and the PS4 Pro resolution boost wasn't present either. This set up an interesting comparison. PS4 and Pro, both with unlocked frame rates, running at 900p resolution. The surprise here is that the PS4 Pro actually held a reasonably consistent 60 FPS at times. The initial gameplay area, for instance, was reasonably close to 60 FPS even in intense combat. Side by side, the Pro was typically clocking a 20 FPS advantage over its weaker sibling, and felt much better to play as a result. However, as soon as we entered the city, performance dived down to the 30 to 40 FPS region, with a framerate readout not much better than the PS4. Most subsequent areas were much the same. There's little to distinguish the two consoles in the rooftop area, for instance. These zones are much more CPU intensive, and the Pro's Jaguar cores simply can't keep pace here to deliver a good 60 FPS output, despite a big increase in GPU power over the PS4. This early version of the Ascent provides some insights into the weak points of last-gen hardware. Some of the smaller areas work perfectly well at 60 FPS on the Pro here, but larger maps with lots of NPCs and enemies just don't scale especially well on the last-gen console's netbook class CPUs. Both PS4 systems are similarly constrained here, and both struggle with frame time spikes. A game like the Ascent just poses fundamental problems for 8th gen consoles, problems that are difficult to overcome without a generational leap in CPU power. The initial release of the Ascent was infamous for long load times on Xbox One consoles. John's coverage highlighted just how bad this could get, with a whopping 2-minute 47-second initial load on Xbox One X. Last-gen consoles were not known for particularly fast loading, but the Ascent was still an extreme outlier, though at least loading was rare once you started playing. Testing the game now, things haven't changed very much. Averaged across 3 runs, Xbox One X takes 2 minutes and 57 seconds in the initial load. One S, bizarrely, takes 2 minutes 31 seconds, 17% faster than One X. In the same test, the new PS4 version completes the initial load in just 1 minute 11 seconds, under half the time Xbox One takes. PS4 Pro, that takes 52 seconds. So what's going on? Well, install sizes for the Ascent on PS4 systems are much larger. PS4 is twice the size of Xbox One and tellingly is about 7 GB in excess of the PS5 version. This suggests that PS4 systems may have more extensively duplicated assets than the other versions of the game. Duplicating assets across the disk improves overall throughput, as it reduces seek times to retrieve data. Other optimizations may be at play here as well, of course. Whatever the cause, load times on PS4 systems are perfectly acceptable and are a pretty tremendous improvement over Xbox One. There is nothing out of the ordinary with the Ascent's load times on PS4, which is high praise considering the state of the Xbox One release. PS5 isn't too far ahead, surprisingly. Off internal storage, it takes 43 seconds to load the opening cutscene, which is definitely an improvement over last-gen consoles, but a rather minor one. Series X comes in a touch faster, with a 38-second initial load. These load times are nothing objectionable, of course, but it's a bit of a longer wait than most other current-gen titles. The Ascent is an excellent game that shouldn't be missed. It's a fun Diablo-inspired isometric shooter, delivered through a capable use of Unreal Engine 4. Environmental detail stands out here, as do the high-quality pyrotechnics in battle. The new PS5 release is a great opportunity for those who initially missed out on the game to catch up. It's very similar overall to the Xbox Series X release, which is to say generally very good outside of some minor performance concerns. The PS4 versions are fundamentally reasonable, although the frequent framerate hitches may prove too much for some. Loading times have been much improved, however, which deserves commendation. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. To view a high-quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch, just use Twitter. That's all for me for now. Thanks for watching.